Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a real mystery, one that's, well, it baffled people for decades. The infamous Circleville letters.
Yeah, and this isn't just, a couple of mean notes. Looking at the sources you sent over articles, notes, bits from case files we're talking about, hundreds, hundreds of threatening letters over almost 20 years, all in this one Ohio town.
Exactly. So our mission today, digging into all this material, is really to pull out what matters most. We want to see what these sources actually tell us about who might have been behind it all, the really bizarre and frankly tragic things that happened because of them, and maybe understand why it's still, well, still unsolved.
It really is a case that seems to have everything, doesn't it? I mean, hundreds of letters spreading fear, a death under very suspicious circumstances, a terrifying booby trap.
And the craziest part, right, the letters kept coming even after someone was supposedly caught and in prison for something connected to it all.
That's the absolute core paradox here.
Yeah.
It jumps right out from the sources.
Okay, let's start there then. The core mystery. What was this? What was the initial spark, according to the material we have?
Well, what the sources show is this was just a poison pen campaign on a massive scale.
Yeah.
It kicks off in Circleville, Ohio, back in the mid-'70s. Seemed kind of random at first, targeting different people, but it quickly zeroed in on a school bus driver, Mary Gillespie.
And the accusation against her was?
The letters claimed she was having an affair. The school district superintendent started off seeming like, someone just morally outraged, but it ramped up fast.
And it didn't stay just words for long. Things got much darker.
Oh, absolutely. The sources really focus on two huge tragic events. First, Mary's husband, Ron Gillespie, died in 1977. Still very suspicious circumstances to a lot of people.
Right.
And then, years later, 1983, this really violent roadside booby trap is found.
And someone was arrested for that trap.
Yes, that's right. A man named Paul Freshour, he was actually Mary's former brother-in-law. He got convicted of attempted murder for setting up that device.
Okay, but here it is. The part that, like you said, makes this whole thing just so baffling based on these documents. What happened after Freshour was in prison?
This is it. This central, undisputed fact that just hangs over everything in the material. The letters kept coming while Freshour was locked up. And that fact alone just explodes the whole case, makes you question if they ever got the right person or if maybe there was more than one writer all along.
It really does make you wonder. Let's walk through the timeline. Using the details from the sources seems key here because the order of things is so important. So that first wave back in 76, 77, what did that look like?
Okay, so the letters start showing up in 76. First, they go to Mary and her husband, Ron. But then pretty quickly they spread out school officials, other townsfolk, basically anyone the writer wanted to lean on. The main message was this alleged affair and hints of corruption tied to it.
And there was something weird about where they were mailed from, right?
Yeah, that's a consistent point in the sources. The postmarks were from Columbus, which is, about 30 miles north of Circleville. So right away, that suggested maybe the writer wasn't, living next door. Maybe someone operating from a bit of a distance.
Okay, then comes August 19th, 1977, Ron Gillespie's death. How do the sources describe what happened that night?
So, story goes, late at night, Ron gets a phone call. Something makes him leave the house, taking his own revolver with him. A short time later, his pickup truck crashes, hits a tree.
And the official ruling?
The official word from the sheriff down in Pickaway County was accident. They pointed to his blood alcohol level, which was 0.16. So driving under the influence?
Wait, even then, people had doubts. The sources mention red flags.
Oh, yeah. Lots of them highlighted in the sources. Big one was that Ron's gun, the one he took with him. It had been fired once inside the truck.
Fired, so not just a crash.
Exactly. And while the ruling focused on the alcohol, a lot of folks in town just felt it was off. Foul play seemed more likely to them. Plus, there's mention that apparently no real analysis was done on, the trajectory of that shot. Where did the bullet go? These kinds of details, they just didn't sit right.
And the letters, they didn't stop after he died?
Nope, not at all. The sources show that between 78 and 82, the whole campaign actually got bigger, more intense.
New targets.
Yeah, now the letters are going to local cops, judges, even journalists who are starting to look into the story. And the tone got harsher, too. Shifted from just accusations to, open threats. And, crucially, The letters started claiming there had been a cover-up by the sheriff's office about Ron's death.
Wow, so the writer is actively using Ron's death now, building it into their narrative.
Precisely. It wasn't just about Mary anymore. Now they were alleging official misconduct, tying it directly back to her husband's death.
Which brings us to February '83, that roadside booby trap. Can you describe what Mary found?
Yeah, it's chilling. She's on her bus route, sees this crude, obscene sign put up. She goes to pull it down.
Yeah.
And behind it, there's a box. And inside the box, a .25 caliber pistol, rigged up to fire right at whoever moved the sign.
Oh my God. Just terrifying. How did they connect that weapon back to Paul Freshour?
Well, the pistol's serial number had been deliberately filed off
Right.
to make it untraceable.
Standard procedure for criminals, I guess.
But the investigators, using lab techniques, managed to recover enough of the number anyway, and that trace. It led straight back to Paul Freshour.
Okay, so based on that gun trace, Freshour gets arrested, goes to trial later in '83. What was the main evidence against him, according to these sources?
The absolute key evidence, the thing really highlighted in the sources, was handwriting analysis. They brought in court-approved experts who testified they'd linked the handwriting on, I think it was 39 of the anonymous letters, directly to samples of Freshour's writing.
39 letters. That sounds pretty significant.
Absolutely.
But was there anything else, like physical evidence, putting him at the trap?
That's the thing the sources point out. There was a real lack of that direct physical evidence for the trap itself. No fingerprints on the box, nothing on the gun rigging. No one saw him put it there.
But despite that lack of physical evidence for the trap scene, he was convicted.
He was convicted of attempted murder in '84. Got a pretty long sentence, 7 to 24 years.
Right. Now, here's where it just goes off the rails into the truly bizarre. What happens between '84 and '94 while he's serving that time?
This is what makes the Circleville case so unique and keeps this mystery burning. While Paul Freshour is in prison, the letters keep coming.
Still.
Mailed to officials, mailed to journalists investigating. And incredibly, the sources say letters were even sent to Freshour himself inside prison.
Wait, to him in prison?
Yes, that's what the sources state. And here's the detail that just breaks your brain.
Yeah.
These letters are often postmarked during periods when Freshour was documented as being in solitary confinement.
Solitary, so zero access to mail, presumably, or anyone to mail things for him.
Exactly, no way to get letters out. So the authorities, the ones who just convicted him, they couldn't explain how these letters, postmarked from Columbus, remember, were still showing up while he's locked down tight, miles and miles away.
So they had no explanation.
Sources indicate, nope, no credible explanation for how this was happening. It just completely undercut the theory that Freshour was the only writer, or maybe even the main one.
Okay, so Freshour eventually gets out.
He does. Paroled in May 1994. Moves down to Florida, the sources say.
And the letters after he got out?
According to the material, the volume dropped off significantly after his release, and they seem to have stopped completely by the mid-90s. But Freshour, for his part, insisted he was innocent of writing the letters right up until he died in 2012.
And the case kind of went cold for a while.
Publicly, yes. But as you noted from the material, there's been a resurgence of interest recently.
Yeah, some of these sources mention true crime shows, podcasts, looking into it again just the last couple of years, 2023, 2024. But despite all that attention, the sources are clear. Nobody has ever been definitively ID'd or charged for writing most of those letters.
Right, so let's maybe pivot a bit and look at the investigation itself based on what these sources tell us. What did the authorities maybe get right?
Okay. Well, the sources do point out a couple of wins for the investigators. That ballistics work on the gun from the trap, for instance.
Recovering the serial number, yeah.
Exactly. Even though it was filed off, the lab managed to raise it and trace it back to Freshour. That was, pretty crucial for getting the conviction on the attempted murder charge.
And the handwriting analysis, too. At the time, that was seen as pretty strong evidence by the prosecution. You had experts connecting his known writing to dozens of these anonymous letters. That really formed the backbone of their case against him for the letters, even if the trap evidence was thin.
Okay, but what about the other side? Where do the sources suggest investigators might have missed things, or maybe mishandled parts of it?
Well, a big one, just unavoidable maybe, was the technology back then, early 80s. The sources really highlight the lack of deep forensic work we'd expect today.
Like DNA.
Exactly. No fingerprints found on the envelopes, which is maybe not surprising given the paper, but also nothing on the booby trap device itself. Today, you'd be looking for touch DNA, things like that. Stuff that just wasn't an option back then.
There's also that note in one source about relying on polygraphs early on.
Yeah, that's interesting. It mentions the sheriff apparently cleared an early suspect because they passed a lie detector test. And, as that source points out, polygraphs, they're just not seen as reliable. They're not admissible in court for a reason.
Yeah.
So using one to completely rule someone out, especially in a case this messy, that seems questionable.
Let's circle back to Ron Gillespie's death again. We talked about the odd details. What did the sources really emphasize as the things that made people question that accident ruling?
Beyond the official BAC level, it really comes back to that fired gun inside the truck. That detail just screams, something's wrong here, It doesn't easily fit a simple drunk driving narrative.
Right.
Plus, there's the mention of how familiar Ron was with that particular road, not someplace he'd easily crash on, maybe.
Sure.
And the lack, apparently, of any follow-up on that single shot. Where did it go? Who fired it?
Yeah.
These lingering questions just fed the local suspicion that it wasn't a straightforward accident.
In the geography, the mailing location seems like something that wasn't fully explored or emphasized.
Totally. The sources really hammer this point. You've got this consistent Columbus postmark 30 miles away from Circleville. That's weird enough on its own. But then layer on the fact that letters keep coming from Columbus. Well, Fresh Hour is locked up, 90 miles south of Columbus?
Yeah.
It just fundamentally messes with the idea that it was one local person behind it all. Yet, according to the sources, this huge geographical inconsistency wasn't really a big part of the trial against Fresh Hour.
So, with all these contradictions swirling around the letters from prison, the questions about Ron's death, it's really no wonder there are so many theories trying to make sense of it all. What are some of the main ones explored in the material?
Okay, one big one discussed is what you might call the inside job hypothesis. The sources mentioned that some of the letters had details, specifics about school business, maybe things from union files, stuff that seems like only someone on the inside, or with close access, would know. Suggesting maybe multiple writers, or at least someone connected to the school district, feeding information, perhaps right from the start, not just some random outsider.
Then there's the angle that seems most connected to Paul Freshour, the family feud angle.
Right. This theory focuses squarely on Paul Freshour. His divorce from Ron Gillespie's sister, apparently, created a lot of bad blood, and he did have access to Ron's gun, the type used in the trap. So you have potential motive there and the means, specifically for the booby trap.
But it doesn't explain the letters continuing?
Exactly. That's the constant problem with theories focusing only on Fresh Hour. They explain some parts, maybe, but leave that huge chunk unexplained.
What about the idea of multiple copycats? Could that explain the ongoing letters?
That's another theory floated in the sources. The idea is maybe after the initial letters got attention, or especially after Fresh Hour was convicted in '83, other people just jumped on the bandwagon.
Out of malice. Or just to stir the pot.
Could be either, or both. They might have imitated the original style, maybe adding their own twists. This could explain why the letters kept going for so long,
Right.
Maybe why the style seemed to shift over time. The Circleville writer might have actually become several different people over nearly 2 decades.
And the letters themselves pushed a theory, didn't they? The sheriff cover-up claims.
They did. The writer, or writers, flat out accused local law enforcement of corruption, especially around Ron Gillespie's death. Now, skeptics of the official story, they sometimes point to how quickly Ron's death was ruled an accident, and these reports about crash photos may be being held back.
As potential signs supporting the cover-up idea.
Potentially, yeah. But it's really crucial, as the sources remind us, to separate the claims made in the letters or by skeptics from, proven facts. There's no hard proof of a cover-up presented in these materials.
Okay. And finally, there's a theory that always seems to pop up in online forums and discussions looking at Mary Gillespie's role.
Yeah, so sources mention this angle, often found in, online conspiracy discussions. The idea revolves around whether Mary might have been involved somehow, maybe orchestrating a deflection, especially since she did eventually confirm she'd had a relationship with the superintendent.
Huh.
But, and this is absolutely vital based on the sources we've looked at, there is zero hard evidence presented anywhere that directly links Mary Gillespie to actually writing or mailing any of those letters. It remains speculative, mostly based on circumstance and motive guessing.
Right. So after all this time, decades later, where does the Circleville letters case actually stand? Legally, publicly.
Well, legally, Paul Freshour served about 10 years for the attempted murder conviction related to that booby trap. That conviction stands. It was never overturned. But here's the thing. Nobody, not Freshour, not anyone else, has ever been charged specifically with writing the hundreds of anonymous letters.
And no charges related to Ron Gillespie's death either.
Correct. No charges ever filed in connection with his death.
What about the public record? Can people see this stuff?
The sources do note that a lot of it is actually out there. A huge archive. Apparently over 900 letters, plus court documents, are available online if you know where to look. But interestingly, Freedom of Information Act requests for the complete sheriff's files on the case, those are apparently still pending. So there might be more details locked away.
And legally, could anything still happen? What about the statute of limitations?
Well, for the attempted murder charge related to the 83 booby trap, the statute of limitations has run out in Ohio. That's closed. But Ohio law is different for homicide. There's no statute of limitations. So technically, Ron Gillespie's death from 1977, that case remains open.
Wow. So it's legally still possible, however unlikely, that something could happen with his death investigation.
It's fascinating, isn't it, when you lay out all the different pieces of evidence for the sources. You got the handwriting pointing one way, the ballistics pointing maybe relatedly, but then the geography of the postmarks, the timing of the letters starting and stopping. They just seem to pull you in completely different directions all at once.
Absolutely. And that lack of a single neat answer, that's exactly why this story just sticks with you, why it keeps getting revisited. It leaves so much open to interpretation, to those competing theories.
It really forces you, when you're looking at all this material, to kind of decide for yourself which pieces of evidence feel the most solid, which contradictions seem the most important.
So maybe here's a final thought to leave you with, something to mull over after this deep dive. Considering everything, the sheer length of the campaign, the conflicting clues, the different people who could have had motives, and especially that undeniable, just baffling fact that letters kept coming while Paul Freshour was in prison, sometimes even in solitary, what seems more likely to you? Was this the work of one incredibly cunning, maybe hidden manipulator pulling strings for decades? Or could it have been more like a snowball effect, a series of escalating acts, maybe copycats, maybe opportunists, all building on that original poison pen campaign? What does that core mystery, the letters from prison, what does that tell you might be the most critical, unresolved piece of this entire puzzle? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the Circleville letters.